Here we have a Villiers 4-speed transmission removed from a Villiers 9E engine that was removed from a Pengor Penguin amphibious ATV. This transmission would have also been used on at least one of the engines used in the Beaver amphibious ATV. And today we're going to take this transmission as far apart as possible. We did have this transmission apart before. It was dirty and hard to inspect. Now it's been cleaned, and when it was taken apart it had already been taken partially apart, so I'm going to start at the beginning more or less with this transmission as if it was just removed from the engine. Okay, so to start, on this side of the transmission we see the gear shift, the gear shift lever, which connects to the rod that connects to the lever between the seats. Here we have a pinion which simply has a contact on it, which would work with the contact which has been removed already for the neutral indicator. The two screws are here, and one of the insulators is here, and the insulator sleeves are there. Here we see the clutch lever. It's loose, of course, because the clutch has been removed from the other side. The clutch lever pushes on a push rod that goes all the way through the transmission, from here all the way through this shaft and out here. The clutch goes on here, and also we see here a drain plug on the bottom here. We see this plug here, which I believe to be a level indicator plug, an oil level indicator plug. On the top we have a dipstick under a little cap. So the dipstick is here. The cap says to use Castrol XL SAE 30. So we would, when we're putting oil in this, we'll just use the straight 30 weight oil. Anyway, the dipstick sits in about there. So it indicates a level about there. Actually, that wouldn't sit at an angle like that. It'd be outside the transmission. Anyway, it's in somewhere like that. So there's the level it would indicate there, which would be about level with the bottom of that hole. So if for some reason there was no dipstick in it, we'd simply slowly add oil until it started to dribble out that level hole. Now, on both of these plugs there are fiber washers. This plug is loose, so I'll just take it out. There's a little red fiber washer there that seals the plug, and there will be one on the drain plug as well. On the back of the transmission we see where the 3 mounting studs that are still attached to the engine crankcase would come through, and there'd be nuts and washers on here. The 4th transmission mounting stud is here. It faces forward. It's here, so that would have a nut and washer on it underneath the engine crankcase. Now, on this side of the transmission we see the output sprocket. This is the sprocket that has the chain on it that goes to the jack shaft, and on holding this sprocket on is a nut and a screw which helps keep the nut from coming loose. Now on here, we'll go back to here. This is a gasket surface, and these are dowel holes. There's short dowel pins that are in the engine crankcase that locate in these 2 holes to help locate the exact position of the transmission in relationship to the crankcase so that the chain lines up. And we want to clean this surface, and this will have a gasket or several gaskets on it. The gaskets that are put here space the transmission away from the engine slightly, as required to change the slack in the primary chain, which would go to the clutch, which mounts on this shaft here. This is the input shaft of the transmission. See, I can turn it without turning the output shaft and vice versa. And in here we see the shift fork assembly. We can see the sprocket here. It's attached to this shaft, which is part of, this gear, which is part of the output shaft. The input shaft is here, and in behind, we can't see it, but there's another shaft. This plug and this plug here indicates the location of the counter shaft, which has another set of gears on it. And what I'm going to try to do here, since the shift lever is on here, I'm going to see if I can get these. Actually, we'll see if we can get the forks to move. Yeah, it doesn't want to shift for us. Anyway, doesn't want to shift for us. We'll, when the gear selector is moved, what it does is there's a sector, which is part of a gear, which rotates a gear on the end of this shaft, which turns the shift fork shaft, and the shift forks move towards each other or away from each other, moving two pair of gears. There's a gear here and a gear here, and another set attached to these two shift forks on the counter shaft. Okay, so we're going to start taking this apart. So, as I said before, these two screws have already been taken out, and the contact that works with this contact on the pinion here to light the neutral indicator light, the screws have been removed and the contact has been taken away. We will also take the cotter pin, which in this case wasn't bent over. The ends weren't bent over, but normally we'd straighten the ends, pull the cotter pin out, pull the pinion off, and in behind the pinion on the shaft is an O-ring. This gear shift lever, if it hadn't already been removed to remove the engine from the Penguin, we loosen this bolt. This is on a set of splines. We might have to gently pry in the gap here to open this up, but it should wiggle off without too much difficulty. So there it is. And in behind the shift lever, there's a snap ring, and there's a washer, and underneath that washer is an O-ring. So we're just going to take the snap ring off and the washer. For that, I'm just going to use two pair of pliers here to hold each end of the snap ring and just open it gently to get it out of the groove. And then off the shaft. We don't want to spread this open any further than we have to. We want to make sure it has proper tension so when it goes back on it stays in place. So there's the snap ring. Now all that's left to do to take this cover off, I'll take the washer off there. So the washer off the gear selector shaft, and there's an O-ring in behind there. So all that's left to do to remove this cover is to take the nuts off these 5 studs, and the nuts and washers are already off here. So with them all off, before I go any further, I'm going to put all this hardware into a zipper bag, a nice sturdy freezer zipper bag, to keep everything together. So this is all the stuff that we took off to get the cover off. So we'll put that all in a bag, and we'll set that aside. Okay, so now as I mentioned before, this transmission has been apart before, but the cover is more or less in place. So what I'm going to do is, actually before we go any further, I'm going to take the dipstick out, and I didn't mention that it also has a fiber washer on it to seal it. See the red washer on it there? That's a sealing washer. funny that they put the sealing washer on there so it doesn't leak, and then there's a vent hole. Probably may not be able to see it, but there's a vent hole in there, so if oil wants to, you can see the vent hole right there. Oil still can bubble up and out of that, but it's not usually a problem. Okay, so all those parts are in the zipper bag and it's set aside. Okay, now, so we're going to knock this cover loose. I'm going to use a dead blow hammer. It's got lead shot in it so it doesn't bounce when you hit something, and it's got a plastic face, and we just want to tap this cover. We want to be careful taking this apart because we don't want to break anything. And that cover has separated a bit. We'll see if maybe it'll come off. There we go. And what usually holds that cover on after the nuts and washers are taken off is there are dowel pins here. As I mentioned, the dowel pins that go in the transmission case here, there are also dowel pins to locate the cover. Okay, so the cover is loose. The gear selector assembly is going to come with it, and if we push on the input shaft and the shift fork assembly will all come out with the cover. And what we want to be careful with, something that's not shown in the manual, if you have a parts manual to show you where everything is in here, in the end of the output shaft, right in here by this gear, there's a set of loose ball bearings. Now, I've had this apart, cleaned it and put it back together and used grease to hold the bearings in place, but usually when you take it apart, any oil that's left in here won't hold the ball bearings in place. So when you take the shaft out, the balls fall and go everywhere, so you have to be careful pulling this out. And watch for the balls that are down in here. If you can see them in the camera. There, you can just barely see them in there. I believe there's 14 of them all set in this gear. So anyway, those are in place. You just have to be careful as you take this apart that they don't fall out. And so here's the cover with this is the input shaft, the splines for the clutch, the shift fork assembly, and the counter shaft. So we should be able to slide all of these out of the cover. All is one big lump here. We'll just set that aside for now, and I'll explain what we see inside the cover here. This is the sector on the gear selector assembly. Underneath this washer is a set, actually two sets of roller bearings. That washer was held on with grease. So there are the roller bearings. There's an outer race, the steel part that the bearings ride on, and there's one set of rollers, and directly behind them is another set of rollers. So again, taking this apart, there isn't normally grease in there. You have to be careful the washer doesn't fall off and all the bearings fall out. Now, since we have the washer and snap ring off of the gear selector assembly, it should push up and come out. Wiggle it and it'll come out. So there we have the cover with the O-ring for, we'll take the one off the gear selector shaft, and this one is broken. This is the one off of the shift fork shaft, so those O-rings will be replaced, and we're going to check these bearings, these bushings at a later time here. So we'll just set that cover aside, and we'll start with the gear selector. What we now that we have it out, what we want to look for on it is, let's check for wear on this shaft. You can actually just, without the O-ring there, it should slide in a little easier. It's a pretty good fit. It's not falling right into place, so I would say this bushing and the shaft here are in good shape, they're not worn out. We'll check this end of the gear selector shaft. It goes into a bushing in the transmission case. We'll just check for play there. There's a little bit. I don't think that's a lot, so that should be okay. We want to check the splines here, that the shift arm assembly goes onto the shift arm slides onto the shaft, and the splines keep it from slipping on the shaft. So the shift lever was on here, so the splines, even though some of them are damaged, they look, I don't know, crushed, or maybe at some point this shaft was turned with pliers. Anyway, they're not damaged to the point where they're not usable. So we'll continue to take this apart. Here we have a spring, which is quite often found broken, so that just comes off. And we have, to take this apart any further, there's a snap ring here. The sector and the body of the gear selector are two different pieces. So to take them apart, we just take the snap ring off. We'll just use our snap ring pliers. And be careful that we don't launch the snap ring into orbit here. So there's the snap ring off. So the sector should come off. And what we want to check with this is, of course, the fit of the sector on the shaft. There's a little bit of play there, but it doesn't seem like a lot. We want to check the teeth. This is essentially part of a gear. So the teeth are same as gear teeth, so we want to check, make sure that they're smooth. There's no chips in them. There's no pits from where there might have been rust. Nothing's broken. And there are teeth here and here, which work with these ratchet pawls. As you move the gear selector with the shift lever, it moves this assembly at the back, which pushes this forward, and then this should come back to its home position. This works with the spring on the cover. So anyway, these pawls work with these teeth, and we want to make sure these teeth are evenly worn. Only half of this tooth, these teeth, and half of these teeth are used because of the stagger on the pawl. See, one pawl is out and the other pawl is in. So we just want to make sure that the teeth look fairly consistent from the back to the front. There's a little bit of wear there. There's nothing broken out, so I think that'll be okay. And these two pawls, and we'll notice the one on the bottom, as we're looking at it from here, the one on the bottom has the longer arm to the left. We have to make note of that. This is the way they should go back together. So these should slide off of here with the spring. We'll be careful the spring doesn't go flying and the pawls don't go flying. And one pawl did go flying. It's gravitated to the floor here somewhere. I'll find it in a moment. Sorry about that, I have to be more careful I don't drop stuff here. So here is one of the pawls. The pawls are identical. It's just when they're in place, one's turned one way and one's turned the other. So what we want to check on here is the condition of the teeth here. You see from the side that the tooth comes to a point. However, this one, half of the tooth is broken away. That tooth looks okay, but I'm not sure that end is used, but this end is broken, so that I think we'll have to replace. The small tooth here looks fine. The other one, if we look at it from the side, it's rounded a bit and it has a piece broken off of it, so I think we'll have to put a set of pawls in this. And that's the gear selector assembly apart. So again, we'll get our bag out here. Just set these together. All of this stuff in a bag. So we have 2 main pieces, the 2 pawls, the 2 springs, and the snap ring. Oh, and just a note on the snap ring while we're here. While I think of it, I'll dig it out again. Their snap rings are, and this one's actually, I've twisted it, so I won't reuse this one. See how the ends don't line up? These snap rings, I'm not sure that they're all made exactly the same. There you go, dropping stuff again. When the snap ring is made, it's punched out, and what that gives us is one side where the edges are rounded, and on the other side the edges are very square. So what that means is when we put this on, we want to put it on so that any force attempting to pop this off while it's assembled is against the square edges. So for example, in this assembly, any force trying to make this pop off would be from behind. So we would want to put the rounded edge, and if you look, you can see that there's, you may not be able to see it in the camera, but this side is slightly rounded, and this side, the edges are very square and almost sharp. So we'd want those sharp edges facing out. So that's just a quick note, something you may have known about snap rings, but anyway, that's that assembly. And I'm going to take these O-rings and put them in the bag as well. Snap ring pliers we don't need, these we may not need. Okay, so now we'll go to our gear shafts. So again, we have the shift fork assembly, the input shaft, and the counter shaft. Now these all just sit, the gears with the collars on them sit on the shift forks, so these can be just lifted free of the shift fork, and that will be lifted free. And here is the shift fork assembly. So what we want to check on this is this surface here, where the bearings, this surface here, where the bearings ride. We want to make sure that's smooth. So this is a gear, so we want to make sure the teeth are all intact, there are no chips out of them, there's no pock marks in them from where there might have been rust. We want to just make sure that these rotate on the shaft okay, they don't stick in any one position. It's hard to demonstrate exactly how this works with it out of the transmission. But anyway, essentially these stay in the same position relative to one another on the shaft, but as the shaft turns, it turns in both of them, and these will move together or away to move the gears on the shafts. And actually what we want to do besides check the bearing surface here and the teeth here, in the case, this pin here is what this pivots on. So we just want to fit that on there and see how much play there is in it. There's a little bit. Not sure what the tolerance is, like what the allowable limit is, but I think that's okay. So we'll take that out. That, I believe, is okay. Oh, we also want to check the shift forks. This is the surface where the collars and the gears ride. We want to make sure there isn't any real amount of wear. You might be able to see this is shiny from a bit of wear, but I don't feel a big step in it. There isn't really any wear of any note here, so I think that shift fork assembly is fine. So then we'll go to the counter shaft, which is at the back of the transmission. The counter shaft is made up of 1, gear with a collar behind it. A second gear with a collar on it. That's a gear that's worked with the shift fork. Another gear with a collar on it. Another one that's moved with the shift fork. And then we have the shaft itself, which has a gear as part of it. We want to check all these surfaces here, the teeth on the gear. We want to make sure these splines aren't worn in one spot. And we can check the bearings, sorry, the bushings in the cover. So this is the cover, this is the front of the cover, this is the back of the cover. This is the end that fits in here. Check for play, there isn't a lot in there. So this end with the gear on it goes in the cover, sorry, in this case. Call the cover the case, and the case the cover. And there is a bit of play there, but not a lot. So that gear is in constant mesh with the output shaft, as we can see here. Anyway, so again, all these gears we want to check the teeth, and with these gears with the collar on them, we want to check to make sure the collar is in good shape. This one has a little bit of rust on it. We just want to make sure there isn't any loose rust that can flake off of there. So we'll put that on, this other gear on, and any gears that have these teeth on them here, we want to check to make sure these teeth are in good shape. They lock into another gear, teeth mesh like that. We want to make sure the edges aren't all rounded off, none of these teeth are broken off, so they look okay. Now this collar looks to be okay. It's not split, it's not rusty, and it is it's not perfectly cylindrical. There's grooves in it, so it fits over the splines here. It fits over here like that. And then this gear, again, we check the edges here. We can check the bearing. There's actually a bronze bushing in it. We want to check and make sure it's not a really loose fit on the shaft. It seems okay. Check the teeth here. And these teeth should be fine, because they're actually only used for a transmission with a kickstart, which of course our Penguin doesn't have, so those shouldn't have any wear on them at all. Anyway, that's the counter shaft, and if we want to go ahead and put it back on the shift fork assembly, the shaft the gear that has the teeth for the kickstart would be on the same side as the neutral indicator, which is on the end of this shaft. So we'll just set that back on there, and then we'll go to the input shaft. The input shaft has a collar on it. It has two sliding gears, the larger one on the right, and it has, that's the first gear here, has teeth on it that engage in actually the gear that's the output on the output shaft. You want to make sure the edges aren't really worn a lot. Make sure there's no burrs there. Teeth are in good shape. The collar's in good shape. The same with this other gear. Everything there looks good. The splines here aren't worn thin in the center or anything. They seem to be fairly straight here. These surfaces seem to be okay. There's a little staining on here, but there's no grooves or marks in them. Something I noticed is these teeth on this gear have, I think, had a bit of rust on them. Some of the teeth are perfect, and some of them have marks on them like they were rusty. Now we'll check the fit of this shaft. This shaft goes here in the cover. Now that shaft turns all the time when the clutch is released, so that bushing gets used anytime in every gear, including neutral. So there's not a lot of wear in that. And this part of the shaft runs in, actually we'll put the collar back on, and we'll do two things here. The collar back on here, Now the ball bearings are still in this gear here, so we'll put this in here. We'll check the bushing in the output shaft, between the output shaft and the input shaft, and there's a little bit of play but not a lot. And with the collar there, we'll spin the shaft and see. There doesn't appear to be any, I don't feel any roughness in the bearing in there. So the ball bearings, the collar, and the surface that the ball bearings rest in this gear, I would say are all in good shape. So we'll take that shaft back out of there. Take the collar off. Then we put the small gear on. Just put this all back together so that it's the large gear on, because it meshes with the gear that's on the output shaft. And the two collars are together. We'll just put this collar on. Again, it's not perfectly cylindrical, it's got grooves because it fits over the splines here. And that goes on there. And then we can set the shaft back in the shift fork assembly. With the shift fork assembly here, this goes out the cover and this goes out the case. So just put the collar back on there. I want to sit right there on their square, so we should be able to put that shaft on there. So there, you'll know if you have any of these gears in the wrong position because it won't go back together. They're all different sizes, so they'll only go back in the shift fork assembly if the gears are matched. So these two gears have to be put together, these two gears have to be put together, and these two gears have to be put together. But this one's part of the shaft, this one's part of the shaft, so it's hard to mess those up. But anyway, that's the shafts in the shift fork assembly. Okay, so we'll set the cover back here, set those together, and now we're going to take the sprocket off of here. Now, again, I have had this apart before. First thing we need to do to take the sprocket off is to take the screw out. This is a lock screw to keep the nut from turning. So, take that screw out. And as with all of the fasteners on this engine and transmission, as we take them apart, we want the screwdrivers and the wrenches to fit the heads of the screws and the nuts as best we can to avoid stripping them. So there is a screw and lock washer, which I'm going to take right away and put in a zipper bag here. Like I mentioned, these are freezer bags, so they're nice and heavy. They don't tear as easily as just a regular sandwich bag. So now, normally this nut is tight. I'm not sure what the torque spec for that was, but anyway, it's tighter. It should be tighter than it is now. So to take this off, take that nut off, we're going to have to hold this somehow. And what I have is a customized chain wrench. Chain wrench came somewhat like this. Actually, the chain that was on it, the chain that was on this chain wrench is here. It looks just like a regular chain, except the way it's assembled. The side plates are close together and the pins go all the way through. That's so you can set it in different notches in the end of the wrench here to change sizes for whatever you're trying to grip. So what I did to take that off, I simply ground the head of a rivet off that held this chain on where this chain is. Yeah, this chain on where this chain is. I just ground the head off the rivet and pushed the rivet out to take that chain off. And this chain is actually the chain off of a Penguin that goes between the engine and the jack shaft. So I know it'll fit this sprocket. So to use this, we wrap the chain around the sprocket, and then if this was tight, I would put a socket on there and possibly either a ratchet or an impact wrench. I actually did this earlier with an impact wrench. So this nut comes off. So there's the nut, and underneath it is a dished washer. Dished because it's kind of shaped like a shallow bowl. It's not flat. So when this washer goes on, notice when it came off, the outer edge contacts the sprocket. If we put it on backwards, then the inner edge of the washer would contact the sprocket. So when it goes back on, we want the outer edge to contact the sprocket, and the inner edge is raised, so we'll want that against the nut. Anyway, we can take our chain wrench off there, and then we can take our sprocket off. And in behind the sprocket is a seal, and on the shaft, working against the seal, is a spacer. And this is a fairly snug fit in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this up on some supports, and I'm going to actually try something. I'm going to try heating this with a hot air gun to see if I can get the aluminum to expand to get the bearing out, because behind this seal is a bearing, and I can feel some roughness in that bearing, so I want to change it. So I'm going to set this up, get the hot air gun, and come back. Okay, so what I've done is I've placed a block of wood underneath the transmission case to get it up off our work table, so that the studs that hold the cover on aren't resting on the table. And I'm going to use a heat gun, normally used for stripping paint, and I'm going to apply some heat to this area here. The theory is aluminum expands at a greater rate than steel. The bearing is steel, the case is aluminum, so I'm hoping that the case will expand so that the bearing, which is now a press fit, will become loose. I don't expect the shaft and bearing to fall out on their own. They may need a gentle persuasion, but anyway, they should need a little less force than that. So now, normally we don't want to apply heat to a seal. Seal being rubber or a type of plastic will melt, but this seal is going to be removed anyway. We're going to replace it, so that if we happen to damage it in the process of getting this apart, that's not a problem. So I'm going to apply heat again around here and see if this comes apart a little more easily than it will right now. just going to try this. Again, this is a heat gun. We've been applying heat, so this is going to be hot, especially the top. So I'm going to just hold it here to support it. Try tapping it again, and there we have the bearing has come out with the shaft, the output shaft. So it may be warm as well, so I don't just want to grab it. So I just want to keep it from falling. The case is warm here, but anyway, I'll just take it out here, handle it with the pliers. Okay, so there is, again, this is probably hot. I'm not going to try it. Here's the output shaft. These are the splines the sprocket was on. Here's the bearing that we wanted. And in here, in the seal, captured in the seal here, is the spacer. I'll take that out. There's the spacer. And so there's the area the bearing was in. And the seal. The seal actually doesn't seem to have suffered, but again, we're going to replace that anyway. And now we can simply take a brass punch and just push that seal gently out. Again, this is going to be warm, so I'm not going to touch it. This spacer's probably warm too. And one thing we have to remember is, as we can see, as we warm this up, or maybe just because it's been in there so long, the ball bearings that are in here that I had held in with grease are starting to fall out. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So all 14 of them are still there. That is a little warm to the touch. I'm just going to set these back in. I believe there should be 14. Yes, there's only 14 in there. There's no room for any more. So I haven't lost any of the ball bearings yet. Anyway, I'm going to take those out of there very shortly so I don't lose them. But now, what we want to do is to take this bearing off of this shaft. And it is still warm. So actually, I'm just going to let that sit and cool down for a bit. I'm going to set this hot air gun away somewhere. The end of it will be hot, so I'm going to set that somewhere so it'll cool. And then I'm going to get something to help us separate this bearing from this gear. We'll be back shortly. Okay, we're ready to continue. Now, something I'll just mention here. I was going to remove the seal, but I think before I remove it, I will make sure this is clean and I'm ready to put the new seal in so that I can see the exact position of this seal in the case before I put the new seal in it. I don't have to, if I take the seal out now, I have to try to remember, was it flush on this side, was it flush on this side, how exactly was it in. Anyway, I'm going to wait until I'm ready to install the new seal before I remove the old seal. Set that case aside for now. And what we have here, we have the output shaft, the gear. And what I've done, before I lost them, I took the ball bearings out of here and put them in a zipper bag so they're not likely to get lost. And we can check the teeth on here, the teeth on here, the splines on here. We know the bronze bushing in there is in good shape because we tried the input shaft in it. So what we want to do is take this bearing off of the shaft because it's got a little bit of a roughness to it. And this bearing is actually a 6205 bearing. It's an easy to get bearing. And this one has no seals in it. I can look right through it. So what I have here to take this bearing off is I have a bearing separator. Whoop, I have a bearing separator that's losing pieces. And I have some support blocks here. So what I'm going to do, the bearing separator is very thin here. So I'm going to place the bearing separator this way so that the sharp, what would have been a sharp edge is facing up because we're going to apply force down. I want the bearing separator to hold the bearing. I want it to grip the bearing. So I'm going to close it. my hands and then put some tension. See, tighten these nuts up so that the bearing separator can't come apart. I'm not going to tighten it with a wrench, I'm just going to tighten it by hand. Put the blocks far enough apart so that the gear can come through. This is still a little bit warm from taking it out of the case, but and then hopefully, now it's slipped here, so I think we've had some movement, so I'm going to push this together a little further. Tighten these nuts again, something must be moving here. Again, just tighten these by hand, and solve the bearing, and there we go. So there we have the bearing, and we can feel that it's rough. It's actually, yes, it's got no seals in it. And there is our output shaft with a spacer on it. So we'll want to clean all of this up and have it ready to go back together. And we can use the trick to install the bearing on this shaft. Even though it was a press fit, it required force to take it apart. What we can do is we can warm the bearing to expand it a little bit, and we can shrink the shaft by putting it in, say, one of our zipper bags and putting it in the freezer, in the fridge, for a couple of hours. So that will shrink it, not a lot. We'll warm this up just by using our hot air gun again. Again, it doesn't have to be red hot, just has to be to the point where it's too hot really to touch. That will expand this enough and shrink this enough that we should be able to take a pair of pliers once this is heated up and simply drop it on the shaft. And actually, this bearing we won't be reinstalling because it's got a little bit of roughness to it, so we'll just replace it. So anyway, that's the transmission apart, except for the seal, which we're not going to take out until we're ready to put the new seal in. Just another quick note here. Because I had taken this apart and cleaned it, I forgot to mention one thing. So we go back to the cover. This is a gasket surface here. The old gasket has been removed. It's a paper gasket that goes on here, and I just simply took my thumbnail to remove most of the old gasket. There's still some there, so I'll take maybe a razor blade and just very carefully make sure there's no old gasket still on there. I would not recommend using anything abrasive like I've seen gasket or surface discs on die grinders. I would simply use either a plastic razor blade or a new single edge razor blade and just make sure there's no old gasket material there, and clean this whole machine surface here in preparation for a new gasket. On this side, this is not a gasket surface. The right hand side cover does sit against there, but that isn't a gasket surface. And of course, on the case, this is the gasket surface for the cover. Those are the dowels that were mentioned here. So we'd make sure this is clean. This isn't clean at the moment. Yeah, there's still some old gasket on there, so we'd clean that all off. And we will clean this whole surface here, because there's at least one gasket there, possibly as many as 4. Again, the gaskets are used as shims to adjust the amount of slack in the primary chain. Anyway, sorry I missed that as we were taking it apart, but we've covered it now. While we're talking transmissions, here's another transmission from a Villiers engine. I believe this is also 4-speed. It looks very similar to the transmission in the Penguin. Almost looks like we could bolt it right into the transmission, right into the Penguin. Except this has a few differences. First of all, it's coming apart. Here we can see actually the contact for the neutral indicator, but this has an extra shaft sticking out of it, and this cover is a little different. It has a raised area here where our other cover, I'll just, instead of relying on our memory, we'll just compare. So this cover is the one from the transmission in the Penguin. This is our transmission, we'll call it our parts transmission. Anyway, see the shift lever, the clutch lever is missing from it, but it's different here. This is different. There's a nut here that's not on here. So it looks very similar. The case is probably the same, but the cover's different. And if we take the cover off, you'll see it does have some internal differences. Here is part of the kickstart mechanism that of course isn't used on the Penguin, and there's the teeth that mate with the teeth on that gear that aren't used in our machine. So that looks pretty much like the transmission we're working with here, and the right way around. So yeah, those look to be identical from this view. Inside the cover, there are differences. The inside the cover is different. There's a area here that's different. The bearings are gone out of here. They must be set away somewhere. There's a large bronze bushing here for the kickstart shaft. The gear selector is totally, well, the sector looks the same, but the gear shift assembly is, the gear selector assembly is different. So anyway, that's just another look at a different transmission. And actually, just pull it apart here and see if it's got the same, see if it looks like it has the same gears as the other transmission. So there's the case with the seal still in it. The bearing has been removed. There's the output shaft. This is the input shaft. See, this one's a little rusty. Actually, it's got surface rust on it. That would have to be well polished before it was used, but anyway, it appears to be, actually this one's a little more worn here. The edges are a little more worn here, but that gear, there's surface rust on it, but it doesn't appear to have rusted enough to mark anything. And it's just stained here from rust, but again, this assembly looks the same as what's in the Penguin. So, and there are, actually that all looks like the same stuff that was in the Penguin transmission. So, if we needed to, there's a spare case, input shaft and gears, except for maybe this gear. This one's, if we were say looking for parts for the transmission I just took apart, I wouldn't use this gear because it's worn a little more than the one we have. If I wanted to replace the input shaft, I'd clean this up, polish it, and make sure it cleans up okay. But the gear on this looks better than the one in the transmission we just took apart. I don't think there's anything else that we'd want to try to use off of this transmission, but anyway, if we need parts, I have no doubt that we can order any part that we need for this transmission as a new old stock part out of the Villiers parts suppliers I normally go to in England. But if we have used parts that we can use, we may use those in place of new old stock parts since we have them in hand. And this transmission is not a transmission that we would use in a Penguin. We might use the case if for some reason the case was damaged, but we might just hang on to what we can use and perhaps see if anybody else that uses one of these transmissions with the different gear selector and kickstart on it needs any of those parts. Anyway, just a look at a slightly different transmission to see that although some of it's different, some of it's the same. And one other thing, as you may have noticed, I'm working out in the driveway, in front of the garage, behind an enclosed trailer. And some of you may have wondered what's in the enclosed trailer. there's a beaver in the enclosed trailer, which is going to a car show the day after tomorrow. So tomorrow night I'm going to be making sure that this still starts and runs okay, and there's air in the tires and everything's tied in here, and we'll go to a car show and see what people think of it. Maybe see if we can find any more of them. Oh, and on top of the beaver, you can't read it there, is a Mark's go-kart racer kit. A kit of plastic parts and a set of plans to build a sidewalk racer or downhill racer. It's dated about 1971. Anyway, it's still in the box. Nobody's ever put it together, and I have the wood cut in rough. Maybe sometime in the not too distant future we'll see one of those go together. Anyway, that's what's in the trailer.